What's going on, guys? Jacob Ober here. Welcome back to another episode of Packers Top 5s. And in this episode, I'm going to be ranking, in my opinion, the top 5 quarterbacks to play for the Green Bay Packers in Packers history. Now, before I really get into it, I just wanted to let you guys know that there's a lot of quarterbacks that I took into consideration for this list, and there are a few of them that played in a much earlier era. I'm talking about like 1920s, 1930s, even 1940s, that I just didn't really know if I should include or not, and I decided against including it because I just don't know like how to judge a player from that far back. I mean, their statistics compared to today are absolutely horrendous. I mean, these guys are like throwing like way more interceptions than touchdowns in a season. If we judged them by today's metrics, they would not even be in the league. But I just didn't really know how to like get a good read on exactly how good they were, so I just decided to leave them off the list. So for the most part, this list is going to be players that played from the 1950s onward for Green Bay. So without further ado, let's get right into the list here with my number 5 quarterback of all time in Packers history, that being Magic Man Don Makowski, who played for the Packers from 1987 to 1992. In his career as a Green Bay Packer, Don Makowski threw for 10,870 yards, 56 touchdowns, and 56 interceptions, completing 55% of his passes. In 1989, he led the Packers to a 10-6 season and was in the running for NFL MVP when he threw 27 touchdowns that season as well, and for over 4,000 yards as well, too, which was quite the rarity back then in the 1980s for quarterbacks to be throwing for 4,000 yards. That was like today's 5,000-yard mark, so that was a pretty big accomplishment for him. Unfortunately for Makowski, that was really the only good season he had with Green Bay, but he was the precursor to Brett Favre, and that's really what he's best known for, I think. That game against the Bengals in '92, Week 3, I think he sprained his ankle or something. Favre came in and never let that job go. Don Makowski was a very, very talented player. Of course, he predates my era, but I have heard several stories of him. I've heard about all the things that he did for Green Bay, and of course, I've seen that game where where Brett Favre took over for Makowski, and that's really where I know him from. But, overall, he was a solid quarterback for the Packers, and that 10-6 season in 1989, I'm sure, is going to live in the memories of a lot of Packer fans living back then for a long time. Coming in at number 4 on my list of top 5 Packer quarterbacks of all time, I have Lynn Dickey, who played for the Green Bay Packers from 1976 to 1985. Lynn Dickey threw for 21,369 yards in his career as a Packer, along with 133 touchdowns and 151 interceptions, to go along with a 56.2 completion percentage. Lynn Dickey, he was a Packer for a pretty long time, about close to 10 seasons, I would say. I think it actually was exactly 10 seasons where he was the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers. And, of course, like I said with Makowski, Dickey does predate my era, but, there was a lot of Packer fans back then who probably have very fond memories of Lynn Dickey, the original number 12 Green Bay Packer before Aaron Rodgers. And his 1983 season was a very, very good one if you look past the 29 interceptions. And Lynn Dickey was a guy who tended to throw a lot of interceptions, but that season was a very, very special one for the Packers. Threw 32 touchdowns that season as well as for 4,400 yards, which was quite the statistical achievement, as I said earlier, back in the 1980s. So Lynn Dickey gets a spot at number 4 on my list. I really wish the Packers would have surrounded him with a little bit more talent, especially on the defensive side of the ball. The Packers, I know, from what I've heard, had some pretty horrific defenses in the 1980s, but they always had a great offense, so it was always kind of like a scoring duel between two teams when the Packers would play. But, it seems like he would be a really, really entertaining player to watch, and he earns the number 4 spot on my list. All right, now to get into the controversial rankings. Everyone knows who the top 3 quarterbacks in Packers history are. No one has to, explain that to anybody. We all can wholeheartedly agree that the top 3 quarterbacks in Green Bay Packers history are those 3 quarterbacks. Everyone knows who I'm talking about if you're a Packer fan. But it's always different for every single person where they decide to rank these quarterbacks. And for me, I'm going to be putting Bart Starr at number 3, not number 2 or number 1. And I know that's going to make some people very upset. It's also going to get a lot of people who agree with me, I'm sure. But it is a controversial opinion, I think. And the reason I think that is because Bart Starr won 5 championships. But it's also hard to judge him on a statistical basis because, of course, the 1960s were a lot different than the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s. It's a lot different of a football game. There's a lot more emphasis on the passing game nowadays than it was back then. However, I still think I have to put Bart Starr at the number 3 spot because I just feel like he had a lot of help around him. Not saying at all that I think Bart Starr is a bad quarterback. Bart Starr was a phenomenal quarterback, and we are all very, very lucky that he got to play for the Green Bay Packers, and he helped us win 5 championships in the 1960s. But Brett Favre never had the kind of talent that Bart Starr had on his team. He never had the kind of coach that Bart Starr had on his team. Neither did Aaron Rodgers. We all have to remember that the 1960s were great, not because of Bart Starr, but because of the team itself. There was how many Hall of Famers on that team? I mean, you've got Ray Nitschke, you've got Forrest Gregg, you've got Jim Taylor, Paul Hornung, you've got Dave Robinson, you've got Vince Lombardi, of course, as coach. Herb Adderley, Willie Davis. I mean, there's just so much talent on that team, and that's the main reason why I tend to value, at least when I'm ranking the quarterbacks, I tend to value the 5 championships a little bit less for Starr than I do for Favre or Rodgers. Now, of course, Bart Starr was a phenomenal quarterback for Green Bay. He was probably one of the best quarterbacks in the league for a very long period of time. He threw for 24,718 yards, 152 touchdowns, 138 interceptions, and a 57.4 completion percentage, which back then, it'd be safe to say those are pretty excellent numbers. And he also won the NFL MVP in 1966, and he had one of the most famous plays in Packers history with the quarterback sneak in the Ice Bowl to help the Packers win that one. So, yeah, it's kind of tough to judge these players, but I think that my opinion on Bart Starr being number 3 is justified. You are obviously welcome to disagree, but that's just my opinion on it. I have Bart Starr at number 3. Now let's move on to number 2. Coming in at number 2 on my list of the top 5 Packer quarterbacks in Packers history, I have Brett Favre, who threw for 61,655 yards in his 16 years as a Green Bay Packer to go along with 442 touchdowns, 286 interceptions, and a 61.4 completion percentage, along with his 3 MVP titles from 1995 to 1997 and a Super Bowl ring in 1996. Brett Favre has always been one of my favorite players ever. I still think he would probably top the list of my favorite players ever. It's very, very close between him and Aaron Rodgers, and that's really how I feel about the Rodgers-Favre debate. There is certainly a justification for putting Favre at number 1 over Aaron Rodgers. You could cite his 3 MVPs. You could cite his longevity, his consecutive game streak. There's just a lot of things that you could talk about as getting to 2 Super Bowls over Aaron Rodgers' 1 Super Bowl. But personally, I have Favre at number 2, and I really, really love Brett Favre and what he did for Green Bay. And if we're being honest, I don't even think Green Bay would be on the map right now if it weren't for what Brett Favre did and what those guys at the turn of the decade in the 90s did for the Packers. Ron Wolf coming in, trading for Favre, signing Reggie White. Those are 2 of the biggest moves in Packers history, and the Packers would certainly not be where they are without those players and that GM, Ron Wolf. So I have Favre at number 2. For as many times as Brett Favre saved the day, I do have to dock him some points for the amount of times that he has cost the Packers in some pretty crucial situations. You look at the 4th and 26 game, his interception in overtime. You look at the 2007 NFC Championship game, his interception in overtime there. 2001 against the Rams, he threw 6 interceptions in that game. It's just, he's got a lot of great moments, but he also has a lot of very, very bad moments too for the Packers, and that's kind of what's brought him down just a little bit for me. I really, really wanted to put Brett Favre at this top of this list, and if we were going simply by how much they did for the franchise in terms of bringing it back up, then Brett Favre would certainly be at number 1. But I have to factor in everything here, and Brett Favre was an extremely talented player, and I love watching him, but I feel like the guy at number 1 is just a tad better. And coming in at number 1, you guys know the only one left of the three best quarterbacks in Packers history. I have Aaron Rodgers as my top quarterback in Packers history. Rodgers has thrown for 46,400 or 946 yards in his career as a Packer, 364 touchdowns, 84 interceptions, and a completion percentage of 64.6%. He has won 2 NFL MVPs, and he has won a Super Bowl and a Super Bowl MVP. You know, on a purely talent basis, I really feel like there's nobody, maybe in the entire history of the game of football, to ever match Aaron Rodgers. I mean, you maybe Brett Favre and maybe Patrick Mahomes. There's probably a couple others that I might be missing too, but I mean, he's a wizard throwing the football. Aaron Rodgers, I have been absolutely blessed to be able to watch his entire career. He is a maestro on the football field. It's like he's always in control. He limits the amount of mistakes he makes. He has the highest touchdown to interception ratio in NFL history. He's amazing at throwing touchdowns and not throwing interceptions. And that's really, if you think about it, that's really the goal of playing quarterback, isn't it, right? You want to score as many points and limit the amount of turnovers you have. So in a way that he's better at the thing that makes a quarterback their best, better than anybody in NFL history. So, Aaron Rodgers, a big knock on him is he only has the one ring and everything. I really don't think it's as big of a knock as other people might think. One ring is still a pretty huge accomplishment for a quarterback, and it's not like he's out here with no rings. If that were the case, then I would probably have Brett Favre above him. But from a purely, being able to quarterback a team standpoint, Aaron Rodgers is just phenomenal. He plays the position better than anyone I have ever seen. He's lights out. Watching him is an absolute blessing, and I just love this guy, and I love how good he is and what he's done for Green Bay. I have him over Brett Favre, and I know a lot of people. I think for a lot of people, it's probably between Favre and Rodgers for best quarterback. It's probably pretty split. It depends on which era you grew up in. If you grew up in the '90s, you probably pick Brett Favre. If you grew up in the 2000s, 2010s, you probably pick Aaron Rodgers, like I have, and that's okay. We can certainly disagree on these things, but the way that he just limits the interceptions, the way that his arm talent feels superior to anything I've ever seen. His ability to just fit balls into the tightest window. It's beautiful to watch, and that's the reason why I have him over everybody else on this list. And hopefully we can get him that second or maybe even a third ring before he leaves Green Bay or retires, because he really, really deserves it for how much he's done for the Packers over the past decade or so. Anyways, guys, though, that is my ranking of the top 5 quarterbacks in Packers history. To run it back, I had number 5, Don Makowski, number 4, Lynn Dickey, number 3, Bart Starr, number 2, Brett Favre, and number 1, Aaron Rodgers. Feel free to comment in the comment section below your top 5 quarterbacks in Packers history. But in the meantime, guys, thanks for watching. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe, follow me on Twitter at @sports41512, and on Instagram username Jacob_Ober, and I'll see you guys next time. Go Pack, go.